so that we could continually jog around the room to stay warm. I don't think we have enough room for that. So if you need to stand up and do jumping jacks or whatever, go ahead. Meredith did just adjust that, so it should get better. Glad to be here with y'all today. I'd like to keep this, casual as much as possible. So if there's anything that, if you have questions as we go along, just raise your hand, give me a shout or whatever, and I'll try to answer them as we go along. I tried to keep this this discussion pretty general, and if you need more specifics, we can go into a little more detail during the talk, and then also if you need even more specifics than that, or something doesn't make sense, you can catch me afterwards. Myself, and there's several other people in the room that are a part of the Lost Pines recovery team. We've all been working together for the past 3 months, developing recommendations for private landowners in the burn area. Meredith, which you met, Roxanne Hernandez, I think she stepped out. Chuck Kaup, Roxanne's right there. Daniel Lewis, Chuck Kaup with Texas Forest Service, Meredith is with Parks and Wildlife. So several of us are around. Just grab a hold of one of us if you have any questions. All right. Well, let's get this thing started then. All right. The first couple of slides will probably maybe be repetitive to you. You've probably seen these same slides in every talk you've been through today. But just so we're all on the same page, of course, the Bastrop County Complex is what we're talking about today. Of course, this fire impacted people's lives in a lot of ways. It impacted the community. People lost property, and there are a lot of impacts that this fire had. I'm specifically today going to talk about how the fire impacted our natural resources. So knowing that the impacts are very comprehensive, I'm only going to focus on that. So I don't know enough about any of the other to even speak to. So. All right, so you can see the fire perimeter here, 34,000 plus acres. The different colors here represent different land use types. The dark green, which makes up the bulk of the fire area, pretty much that's telling you there's pine there. Anything in dark green has pine in it. It's a pine or a mixed pine oak, something that has pine in it. Some of that could also be cedar, eastern red cedar, but most of it's pine. The yellow that's showing up, that is going to be grazing lands, hay pastures and whatnot. And the dark brown is cropland. If you look at the fire area, 14% of the fire area was in ag use. And the bulk of that, 13%, was pastures, grazing lands. And then 1% was cropland. Some light green, that's oak dominated, primarily post oak, but anyway, the gist of it, I wanted you to get out of it, is that most of it is pine oak woodland, or just pine woodland. Okay, before we can talk about what the fire did to our natural resources, we have to take one step back and talk about what our resources used to be. So our historic condition of the habitat that surrounds us. So not to oversimplify things, historically it didn't all look like this, but we had a lot of the Lost Pines area did look like this historically, 125 years ago and further back. It is a fire-adapted or even fire-dependent community. Habitat type. It was regularly burned. Lightning started fires. Native Americans started fires. They used fire for their own purposes. And so over thousands of years, the Lost Pines area evolved with fire as a disturbance. Because fire was so common, you had a dominant little blue stem grass understory. We didn't have a lot of yellow pond, not near as much as we have today. We had fewer trees. The trees were more further apart. Again, it didn't all look like this. The landscape was pretty diverse. You might have some pine thickets in one area that hadn't burned in a while. Down in the drainages, you would have your yo pond. You would have eastern red cedar anywhere fire couldn't regularly get to, because it's a very fire-intolerant tree. So it was a diverse landscape, but we had a lot of this. And my point is, we don't have much of that today. Okay, so also 2 more points. You cannot have a pine forest without fire. Pine seeds need contact with the soil in order to germinate. And without fire, you get buildup of pine needles and leaves and stuff, and so the seeds can't make contact with the soil, so you don't ever get new pine trees. So over time, without fire, your pine forest turns into an oak yaupon thicket, which we see. You know, y'all can probably envision that. You can think of some area like that you've seen. Also, little oak trees, they can survive just fine in the shade. So they're sitting underneath the pine tree, you know, no fire, so they're happy, everything is cool, and they can survive like that for a long time until the pine finally dies, and then the oak takes off. Pines don't do well in the shade. Pines can't do that. So periodic fires keeping the oaks suppressed is what kept it a pine forest. Okay, back to the future. Unfortunately, this is what a lot of our habitats look like just prior to the fire. There are a lot of reasons for that, the largest of which is probably fire suppression. You know, for the last 100 years, or however long modern settlement, you know, has been in this area, we can't afford to let fires burn willy-nilly. We've got too much, you know, our properties burn, our infrastructure, stuff like that. So we've suppressed any fires that come about, and we haven't had enough prescribed fire in the landscape to take its place. So we get an incredible buildup of fuels. And fuels, by fuels I mean anything that can support a fire. So fuels is all this litter on the ground. It's all the yaupon shrubs, yaupon holly, which those of you that are not familiar with it, it's a very, very common shrub. It actually can grow up to be 20 or 30 feet tall, but it's usually a shrub, and it's real common in lost pines if you haven't had fire in a while. Over time, the pine needles fall and they get hung up in the yaupon and makes them extremely flammable. They're flammable anyway. We've got much more trees. The forest is more dense than it was historically. So let's break these out into 3 reasons, 3 main factors that contributed to the extremely intense historic Bastrop County Complex wildfire. All right, the first 2 are here. Historic fire suppression has led to all this buildup in fuel and a dense forest. Number 2, historically dry vegetation. We've been monitoring the amount of moisture in trees and shrubs and dead leaf litter for decades. And we track this over time. Probably since probably started in the 50s, but you guys have been gathering since probably the 70s, 80s. Texas Forest Service has. On the park, we track this stuff every year. On all our properties statewide, we have never before recorded moistures as low as we recorded in 2011. We didn't know some of these plants could have so little moisture in them and still be alive. We just never recorded moisture levels that low. So, a whole bunch of fuel, historically low moisture in all of our vegetation, and extreme weather conditions. You know, it was a perfect storm. Everything came together at once. But by the extreme weather conditions, we had very low humidities, very high winds, and very high temperatures. So all of those 3 came together and gave us that. Some of you may have seen this in previous talks. This is the burn severity. This is how hot, how intense the fire was by measuring the vegetation. What happened to our habitats. We got it all mapped out. The red is the most extreme, heavily burned. Orange, moderately burned. Yellow, lightly burned. And then green, just not much burned much at all. And then the gray, just a few patches here and there were not burned. The fire started up on the north side, and you can see this red strip right down the middle. It's about 1.25 miles wide, and it's about 17 miles long. That was the initial head fire. Most of it was a sustained crown fire through the treetops. That just took a few hours. That all happened Sunday afternoon. By Sunday evening, it was at the river bottom. So that happened very fast, and then over the next several days, the fire just spread out. It was a flanking fire or a backing fire, and depending on whether it was night or day, or depending on how much fuel there was, the intensity of the fire varied. But you can see we still had some pretty hot spots that are in the red, and if you went back and look at the land use map, these are dominated by pine. Okay, so I'll show you some photos. These are from Bastrop State Park. We have long-term vegetation monitoring plots, and we have photo points at each one. We had just resampled these plots in 2010. These were the photos in 2010. This was the exact same shot right after the fire. This is an example of what the heavily burned, or the red on the map, looks like. Of the entire 34,000 acres, 35% of it looks like that. It essentially consumed all the organic material above the ground, except for the tree skeletons. And it also consumed most of the organic matter in the top layer of soil, anywhere from a ½ inch to 1 inch down. It consumed everything. So just what I said, it killed all the trees. It top killed all the shrubs, yopon and stuff like that. Most all of that will re-sprout from the roots or the stumps, but it killed the tops of them. This is the only burn category where some of the shrubs were permanently killed, and then consumed all organic matter. So the moderately burned. This slide's a little bit deceiving. This was all black and most everything was consumed, but the brown needles already had fallen when we took this photograph and made the ground look brown. 15% of the area was moderately burned. 80 to 100% of the trees were killed. Even though the fire didn't travel through the treetops, there was still enough heat to kill the trees. It still top killed 100% of the shrubs and consumed all the litter on the ground.
How did you know the trees were dead?
If a pine tree is completely browned out, it can't recover from it. If there's no green left. So lightly burned, 1/3 of the area. You can't see it in this photo, but lightly burned has, 20, 30, 40% green trees with green tops. About 25% of the shrubs are still intact, although you can't see it from this photo. But it still consumed most everything on the ground.
That's more oaks.
It's not necessarily more oaks. This photograph happens to show more oaks, but I've got some other photographs in the lightly burned area that were pine, but pine that were a little more sparse, where the canopies weren't so tight. Specifically, there were areas where we had prescribed burn before, because pretty much if you had typical pine forest, it burned at that moderate or heavily burned categories, pretty intense. So to answer your question, the scorched and the lightly burned, yes, more oaks than pine, but there are some areas with pine in it that only burned at a light level. And then scorched, you can see not even all the ground is turned black. There's a lot of litter left. Very few trees were killed. Less than 10% of the trees were killed. Very few shrubs were killed. If you noticed, how do I go back? Okay, lightly burned, that's not a lot of heat on the ground. doesn't normally happen, but our trees were so stressed because of the drought that's been going on since '08 essentially, that it took very little heat to kill the trees. Usually, you know, heavily burned might kill them all, moderately burned may kill, you know, 50, 60%, and then lightly burned kills 10 or 20%. Well, we see everything really skewed where most of the trees were killed just because they're so drought stressed. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so to kind of sum that up, looking at the fire intensity map, if you lump the heavily burned and the moderately burned categories together, that's where most all the trees were killed. 50% of the 34,000 acres experienced that, and that's what we call a stand replacing fire. That's where all the trees are removed and plant succession starts all over again at the ground level. So half of the burn area experienced that level of a fire. If you look at the entire 34,000 acres, about 70% of the trees were killed. You know, I'm saying this like, man, these are hard facts. People in the back of the room know better. This is our best guesstimate. You know, if we don't get any rain for the next 6 months, you know, that percentage is going to go up. So this is our estimate so far. As we've discussed, anything with pine trees burned more intensely. All of our pasture areas, they're categorized as lightly burned. It's rare to get a heavily burned pasture. The roots and the bases of the plants almost always stay intact, and it's rare to kill the plants. So all those are categorized as lightly burned. And then anywhere you had stream sides, Allen Creek, Coppers Creek, they usually have a different kind of litter, compacted oak leaves, and they don't burn very intensely. So Allen Creek, which comes right down through here, you can't make it out very well, but because it's so narrow, it didn't burn very intensely. Okay, so there are a lot of impacts. There's a lot of effects and ramifications, natural resource-wise, from the fire. The largest of which is what we're going to talk about, is the potential loss of pine oak forest. That's what the Lost Pines area is known for. That's what's unique about it. That's the thing that's at greatest risk. Now, you know, if you have a property and you had all oak trees and now they're dead, then that's obviously your highest priority, and that's a really big deal, you know. Any trees are valuable for wildlife habitat and scenic value and shade and all of that. But looking at the big picture, what we risk losing the most is that pine oak forest. We were already, from the year 1998 to the present, losing about 9% of this total habitat every year to agriculture and to commercial and recreational development. Of what we had left, we took a lot of it back to ground level, a large portion of it. So moving forward, what can we do to mitigate, what kind of actions can we take to minimize the damage that's been done or might be done to our natural resources? All right, so fire is usually a good thing for pine seedlings. Every time we burn out at the park, if we have a normal rainfall year, that next year we have a carpet of pine seedlings. That's what they need, usually. We're really unsure what's going to happen in the wake of this fire. And I promise, I think from this point of the talk forward, I say I don't know a whole lot, but I'll try to say some other things to mix it up a little bit.
Yes.
Guess, yeah, I can do that. I can guess. All right, so we don't know what kind of natural regeneration. We don't know how many young pines are going to come up following this fire. We've had a couple of wildfires on the park in the last, since '08. We've had very little pine, well, we've had no pine regeneration in those burned areas. Is it the drought? Are the seeds still there? Are they viable? I don't know. Did the fire burn so intensely that it's going to affect germination? Don't know. Also, if we don't have any viable pine seeds left in some of the most intense areas, where is the seed going to come from? Some areas are burned to the point where the nearest pine seed tree may be too far to get a pine seed, where you need it. So all of these kind of bring up questions of what the future is going to look like and how much, if any, pine regeneration are we going to have. We're going to have some. I'm pretty confident of that. I just don't know how much. The key is you got to monitor it. We're just going to have to wait and see. We're going to have to watch these sites and see if pine trees pop up. We don't have anything to plant right now, and it's not a good time to be planting anyway. Without reliable predicted rainfall, you can waste some money and you can waste a lot of energy. We, of course, you kind of have to have a crystal ball for some of that stuff, but we planted 55,000 pine seedlings at Bastrop in the spring of '08. Some north property that was just pasture. Well, it quit raining, '07 there was a lot of rain. Well, we lost every single one of them, 100% mortality. Fire would have killed them anyway, I guess. But anyway, it doesn't do any good to plant as long as we're still in this drought cycle. When we do get ready to plant, what we need is the loblolly that grows here in the Lost Pines. The kind that grows over in East Texas is not going to grow here. The kind they sell at Home Depot and Lowe's and maybe Walmart, those don't grow here. That is, it's called a superior variety. It's a genetically enhanced loblolly pine that's grown in the southeast, including East Texas. They grow really fast, but they need a lot of water. They're just not going to make it if you plant those pines here. You might get lucky and get a couple of years out of them, but they won't last over the long haul. So what we need are the pines that are adapted to the Lost Pines area. Texas Forest Service has about 75 pounds of seed, and they are working to get a nursery to grow those out, and we should be able to, Texas Forest Service will be able to provide local landowners with those trees starting in early 2013, winter of 2012, 2013. And we're going to have to wait on that. We won't be able to plant any pines until then. And hopefully we'll be in a pattern with enough rainfall where they'll live. Now, if you think back to that slide I showed you with the historic habitat with all the grass, well, it didn't have a lot of oaks. There were oaks in that habitat, but not nearly as common as they are today. So after 80, 90, 100 years of fire suppression, we've gotten a lot of oaks and we've gotten a lot of yopon holly. Well, that stuff doesn't just die after a fire. It sprouts. We've now got oak sprouts and some yopon sprouts that are 3 feet tall in the park. So they're coming up fast. This is one of them from the park. That's actually going to be a challenge for us. That stuff is much more common than it ever was historically, so it can come up and it can crowd everything else out. That wouldn't have been a problem 100 years ago. It's a problem now. So we're going to have to think about mechanical or chemical treatments in some areas to keep this stuff from choking out any pine trees. Otherwise, we won't have a pine forest. You can look at the wildfire area. Happened sometime in the 80s out on Highway 71 within this burn footprint in the Cala Vista area. Fire burned through there, and there was already a lot of oaks and yopon present. No treatments were done after it. It pretty much converted to an oak yopon thicket. Very few pines. So if you were in an area that did have grass, before the fire. This is little blue stem, which is used to be the most common grass here in the Lost Pines. If you had any of this grass, or any native grasses for that matter, before the fire, you'll still have them. Fire usually always benefits grasses, and in this case, it didn't kill all of them, but there's been a lot of research on this, and they've shown that it will kill a certain number of the plants. But there'll still be enough plants out there to grow and spread out, and your native grasses won't go away, even if it was a real intense fire, but it's going to take some time. Fires that burn through an area when it's exceptionally dry, like it was this time, usually take 3 years to fully recover to pre-fire levels. Now, thinking about, well, should I be more proactive? Should I get out there and start planting? Replanting and revegetation may be necessary if the area was intensely burned, which affected seeds or rootstock. I don't expect, if you had grasses there before, for it to have burned so hot that it killed everything there. It probably killed some, but it shouldn't have killed them all. But again, I don't know that for sure. But if that was the case, then you could possibly help out by planting, reseeding. Or if you've got an area that is threatened by an adjacent population of invasives or exotics, then invasive plants, they're going to recolonize burnt areas a lot faster than our natives. So you might can hold off some of those exotics, those invasives, by planting some natives. Or if you're in an area where you didn't have any herbaceous vegetation, no grasses or anything before. Say you had a closed canopy of trees, so it was so shady you didn't have anything under there before. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean there's not seeds there, but say that area has a disturbance history. Maybe it was plowed and everything long before, so there's probably not any seeds left. Then you could benefit that area by planting. When we burn at the park, strive fires, sometimes we'll get a real hot spot and it'll blow out, it'll kill several trees in an area that didn't have anything, no grasses underneath it before. In some areas, when that happens, we get all these native grasses pop up that we've never seen before. They haven't popped up, we haven't seen them there in 70 years. They haven't been documented because it's been a tree canopy. So we knew those seeds were there. The same thing will happen in another area and nothing comes up but, ragweed or whatever. Well, once you get to looking, this side over here that didn't have any grasses pop up, it used to be farmed for cotton or something like that. So it's got a disturbance history, so there were no seeds left. We don't always know the answer to that, but it's an important factor. If we are going to reseed any areas, let's use natives. And the Lost Pines Recovery Team has a document out called Reseeding the Lost Pines, where it spells out the recommended plants to plant, and that's on the Bastrop County website. And it looks like this. So this is the recommended native mix that the Lost Pines Recovery Team came up with. The two dominant plants that kind of anchor that community are little blue stem and Indian grass, and green springletop is a great one just to kind of provide the structure that the other plants need to grow. We've worked with native seed companies, so we've got a long list of seed companies, and that's available on the Bastrop County website. I think it's part of this publication, Reseeding Lost Pines, that provide this mix. They know what is needed here. They know the varieties that grow here, and they are ready and willing to provide this to interested landowners. Yeah.
I'm from a seed company, and we're listed on that sheet, but I just wanted to maybe, I don't know if you're familiar with our Southeast Recovery Mix that was harvested from 60 miles from Bastrop.
Absolutely.
It has 56 species, and I just want to make sure that the recovery team isn't saying that that one's not a good plan.
Have you talked to Roxanne?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think what the issue was is that because we're the only seed company that has the local seed from 60 miles away, they can't recommend that seed mix because we are the only seed, it has to be fair to all the other seed companies.
Our goal was to provide a mix that was compatible with the area, that was native to the area, that was simple and readily available. So that, that was our goal. But I recognize that, we all recognize that there will be some companies that have some other products to offer. And that sounds like a good one. Yeah.
About those oak stumps that start to sprout, what'll happen if you just let those go? I mean, will one be a leader, or are you just gonna get an oak bush?
It'll start out as a bush, and then it'll end up a multi-trunked tree, with several main trunks. So a lot of people will trim them back and just keep one. Sometimes those stump sprouts don't make the most structurally sound trees. They can. I've seen them make very beautiful trees. It just depends on how they grow, and how they're associated with that old stump, and if they can send out roots in other directions. So it's kind of iffy on whether they make good structurally sound trees, but you can tell by watching them over a few years. But yeah, I would probably give them a year so you can identify your strongest, leader, and then prune all the other ones back.
Are they growing off the roots of the dead tree?
They usually come right up at the root collar or around the stump.
I've seen them now. I've seen them come up, but I mean, are they from the root of the old
Yes, sir.
tree?
Yes, sir.
So if you want to,
A lot of cases on my property, the tree doesn't look, it doesn't even look dead at all, but I've still got sprouts coming up from the base.
Daniel, if they're sprouting from the base, they should be dead, right?
Well, not necessarily.
Not necessarily?
You can still have adventitious sprouting because, it's kind of like if you overprune a tree, you get a bunch of suckers that come up. Well, that's because you have more sunlight exposure to the trunk and branch tissue. So you can have that going on, but you also have those buds at the base that will come up in response to, you've got stored resources in the root system and no canopy, so it'll put on a flush of sprouts to get some, because it's got to make food with the leaves, right?
Are we on time? Okay, moving right along. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on erosion. Chuck Kopp just gave a talk on that, but I do need to mention it because this is another potential reason for revegetation. And this is one case where we're saying it's okay to use a non-native to get some quick vegetation cover to stabilize that soil. This is a shot at Bastrop State Park after our last rain, and we're starting to see some erosion. In any areas like this, one potential tool, Chuck mentioned a whole bunch of them, but one potential tool is to try and get some immediate cover with vegetation. And the best thing for that is we're approaching the winter time, so that would be what we call a cool season plant. And Elbin rye or beardless wheat, that kind of messed up. Elbin rye or beardless wheat, Elbin rye 56 pounds per acre, or beardless wheat 60 pounds per acre. But it's not always just as easy as throwing out some seeds and then automatically having some cover. You really need something to cover those seeds up with. People mix it in hydro mulch, they'll cover it with mulch. If you do it right after a fire, the ash can kind of cover it, but we're kind of past that phase. So you're not always going to have success with that technique. You need to cover those seeds with something.
So you're saying 56 and 60 pounds per acre, that to plant, that's how many pounds you're using to plant per acre?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so
Yes, sir.
you-
Yes, sir.
That's winter rye, is that Elbin rye, is that the same as the winter rye that they sell at Home Depot?
No, it's not.
Oh, that's good.
It's yeah. Be real careful in looking at those labels because you got annual rye, you've got perennial rye, you've got ryegrass. All of those are very different. The reason, I think I forgot to mention, the reason we chose these is they're non-persistent. Okay, they're not going to hang around. They're going to come up this first year, and that'll help us hold the soil in place. Then they disappear. They're not going to continue to be there every year, so it's not an invasive exotic that's going to be there over the long haul. It's very temporary.
Isn't that what the winter rye does? It comes up and then it's gonna die out?
Yeah. I'm not saying there aren't other varieties that will work, and I'm certainly not a seed expert, but I know this one grows good in this sand. It comes up fairly well, and it should be readily available from seed companies, and it's pretty inexpensive.
Okay.
I just wanted to also comment, just knowing that seed sources, that you can find this rye at several different places, and to make sure that, that it doesn't have any invasive weeds, seeds in with the rye.
How you know that?
The companies have to give you a
At least.
seed test label that says if there's any weed seeds in there. And if there are weed seeds listed on the label, you should ask that company, what weed seeds they are, to make sure it's something you don't want to introduce into your land that wasn't good for it.
Seeding is not a catch-all, and it's not a silver bullet, and it doesn't always work. And, typically, the best thing you're going to be able to do to get something to grow is to disc it in, but I'm not going to recommend discing any of your country that was burned over. I think you're only going to compound your erosion problems. But there may be other ways you can cover that seed up. And you may get some germination anyway, just having it sit on top of the soil if the birds don't pick it all up, or it gets sun-scorched or whatever. Not the silver bullet, but it's one tool available, and Chuck mentioned in his erosion talk all kinds of structural things that are available, straw wattles and contour felling logs across slopes, and a lot of things like that. So there's several options, and all that information is on the Bastrop County website.
Most people don't realize that hydromulch is actually relatively cheap. If I remember right, it might be 30, 40 cents a yard. So they can cover a lot of area for not a whole lot of money. They mix the seed in with it. It's the same stuff that they'll spray out on highways. It's kind of a green slurry that goes out on top. It will kind of harden to somewhat of a crust, and it'll hold up to some rains in terms of not washing away. But hydromulch is relatively cheap, and there's a lot of companies that do that if you look for them.
Just because I talk to lots of customers about seeding every single day, and just make sure that if you do hire a hydromulcher, that they clean their equipment before they come out to your property, because there could be, for invasive species in their equipment that they might have, used in a previous.
It doesn't work without rain, so you're wasting your money. I see commercial guys spend tens of thousands of dollars on it, and it doesn't do a bit of good unless you've got rain, or you're gonna have it. You're just wasting your money because birds and other things will disturb it.
The most critical component to this equation is you have to have moisture. That's more important than all the other things I said. I'm glad you brought that up. Some of the structural methods to mitigate erosion don't require rain.
So would it,
Yeah, that was weird, wasn't it? I guess they do that, actually.
I've done a lot of landscaping, and of course, whenever we do hydromulch, we irrigate so that it comes up. Would it not, now this is a question, would it not for smaller homeowners that are trying to hold down erosion while we're not having the rains, if you hydromulch and you irrigate to get the stuff up, then once that's rooted in, then we get the heavy rains.
Absolutely. That's a good point. If that ability is there, if that capability is there, absolutely. Absolutely. This slide's just an example of seeding. This was actually on the Colorado wildfire. That's cool season grain, but I can't tell which one it is.
also been until the aqua water is helping out with, people having big water bills or over water usage right now. They're actually helping people maintain their normal water usage for the time being. They're actually cutting pretty big breaks and helping out with that right now as well.
Well, on our property, we just hooked up a hose, and they said we wouldn't be charged with water until, this is on McAllister, that we wouldn't have any charges on water till we began to fill.
Cool.
So that can be months and months, but we're watering some of the plants that come up.
Keep the trees alive and whatnot, help them through the stressful period. Yeah. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is to resist the urge to clean up the place. We absolutely have to do that, you know, in any areas that, if you've got dead trees that pose a safety hazard to any of your infrastructure, you know, buildings or driveways or roads or utility lines, those obviously have to come out. Or any, you know, heavy use areas, you know, where you don't want the tree to fall on your head. Other areas, you know, I would say don't worry about being in a big hurry about it. You can watch a lot of these trees, you know. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't tell exactly which ones are going to make it, which ones aren't. We feel like we have a pretty good idea, but if it's not hurting anything, wait and see. Most all the oaks are, well, yeah, a large percentage of the oaks are surviving. A lot of them are already leafing back out. And the pines that are not completely browned out, you know, if you have a chance to give them a chance, wouldn't be a bad idea. Over the long haul, preserving some of those dead trees on your property provides wildlife habitat for a lot of critters. You know, here is a short list of things that are going to benefit from that standing dead timber over the next several years. They provide insects for a lot of wildlife to feed on, and of course cavities, structure to live in. Again, not a comprehensive list, but a short list of the animals that will use dead or downed trees, logs. Squirrels, mice, bats, woodpeckers, you know, owls. The list is long. Once those dead trees do fall and hit the ground, again, they're still providing valuable wildlife habitat. They're attracting insects that feed a variety of things. They're providing structure and cover for animals to hide. Even our Houston toad, that downed woody material is extremely important. Anytime you find a Houston toad burrowing, it's almost always underneath a branch or a log or something like that. One thing we're doing to try to improve the habitat in areas that were just moonscaped is we're spreading mulch out in areas where we know the toads are underground. So when they come above ground, they've got something to get underneath. We're trying to attract some insects so that they can eat. So we're also creating little brush piles and little windrows that are only not that tall and that wide, but really long. And we're trying to provide some structure for Houston toads once they come out of the ground.
When is that going to be? They usually snow?
It depends on the weather, but for the last several years, from January through April. But they can come out at any time in the winter, spring. And again, I'm very concerned about the exotic plants that we have in the area that could really take advantage of the lack of vegetation. Our natives have been knocked back, and there's a real potential that these may really pick up and become a problem. This Chinese tallow I found on the park the other day, it was already waist high. So I killed it. China berry. He's no longer living either. Luckily, the KR blue stem was not taken on the park. But anyway, these things have much more ability for quick colonization than our natives. So the key is going to be minimize ground disturbance, because the more ground disturbance you the more suitable you make it for invasives. Monitor, so if you got, whatever your property is, keep your eyes peeled for these things creeping in. And then lastly, control them as quickly as you can, either mechanically, cutting them, pulling them up, or with herbicide.
What about the wisteria?
Wisteria is a very hardy invasive exotic, and it is very, very difficult to kill. Luckily, it stays relatively localized. It spreads out, but not as fast as the others on that list. But I've seen it, particularly up in North Texas, Tyler State Park. We've got a bad problem with it. It overtops the trees, breaks them all down, and now we've got a few acres of just wisteria vines. So if you can catch that stuff early.
Well, we had it did kill one of our trees about 4 years ago, but I've been keeping them cut down,
Mm-hmm.
trimmed. It's when they start weeding up those trees.
They can grow fast.
Are there pictures of some of those invasive species on the website, so we know what to look for?
No, but I'm glad you brought it up, and we'll try to fix that.
TexasInvasives.org has.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful resource. TexasInvasives.org.
Say it fast.
Okay, so those of you with grazing lands, I talked earlier about if it's native grasses, the fire combined with the exceptionally dry periods, a double whammy for the natives. It's going to take them a while to recover. Your objective for your grazing property is you want to use your surplus grasses. You do not want to graze and ultimately decline the health of your pastures. So take that into consideration. We don't know much about how Bermuda grass or some other grasses respond. They usually love fire, but as dried as it is, that's an unknown. But at minimum, recommend a 1-year deferment just to maintain the health of your pastures. In summary, there are many unknowns. We're going to have to wait and see on some of this. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we do not have a prior example of such an intense wildfire in the Lost Pines. And it's so unique. We cannot use data from the southeast. We cannot use data from the Rocky Mountains. So we don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. Monitoring is essential, so we know what happens. Some level of active management will be required. This might not have been the case 100 years ago, but our habitats have been altered. And if you do nothing, the pine forest will not be able to sustain itself. So some level of active management, and it will be site dependent, will most likely be required. At minimum, do no harm. There are practices you can get out there and do, planting, whatever, or there's lots of things you could do that actually do more harm than good. So that's what we want to avoid. Sorry to ramble on so long. I hope we have time for maybe a couple of questions.
I've heard that a pine, all the needles are brown, it's dead, but then we have a rain and we get a little green. So what's going on?
I've seen the pines resprouting, particularly young pines I've seen resprout, and they look like they're going to make it. The old pines, I've seen a couple of things. I have seen what looks like they were growing new needles, but in fact, the outer brown needles fell off, and there were a few green needles next to the bud that were on the tree, so it looked like new growth, but it wasn't. So the tree doesn't have a very good chance, but it's possible. And I have seen some mature trees put out brand new growth only to die a week later. Last little push trying to survive, but didn't have enough reserves to make it. Who knows? If there's a little bit of green on it and it's not a hazard, see what happens. Yes, sir.
Would pruning the oak's limbs help it?
Daniel?
Not the big, 2 or 1 inch limbs, but I'm talking about the ones that have the blue twigs that shot out during the spring that are out there that.
Well, pruning is another form of stress for the tree. So they've already undergone the stress of the extreme and ongoing drought, and then the fire then you can prune off what is dead.
Another quick question or two?
Yeah, you talked about leaving some dead stuff.
Yeah.
Where's the trade-off between leaving some dead stuff and having a whole bunch of dead stuff that's a fire hazard? I mean, is it just sort of common sense, or?
No, that's actually a very difficult question. And we are struggling with that very thing on the park. Have all this down woody material, all these logs on the ground eventually. We're trying to use prescribed fire to keep out competition, but the logs are gonna make everything so hot out to keep from killing our regeneration. It's a trade-off, and there's no easy answer to that. The big logs are not a big fire hazard because they don't, you know, they get kind of intense, but they don't move very fast through it or anything. So that's not a big risk from a homeowner standpoint, but I think it's a bigger risk. The brush and all the fine fuels and stuff like that's a much bigger risk because it can move through that real